Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Skillshare. After years of being in films and TV shows that weren't well seen beyond his home country of Canada, there's something very fitting about the fact that Jim Carrey's big break in the US came in the form of a sketch comedy show. In Living Color only lasted from 1990 to 1994, but in that time, the show managed to launch the careers of Jim Carrey, Jamie Foxx, and even Jennifer Lopez. It was the perfect way to introduce Carrey to a new audience, because his acting style seems almost tailor-made for sketch. He's the definition of over-the-top, committing to every bit like a rubber-faced cartoon character. And though he would go on to perfect that act in movies, the basics are all laid out on In Living Color, the same comedic tools he's still using today in Sonic the Hedgehog. I think what's so interesting about the actor, to me, is that, with some exceptions, what the audience seems to want from him is still fairly limited and feels very tied to the 90s and early 2000s. He was probably the single biggest comedy star in Hollywood for 10 solid years. But his career seems less about growing and evolving into new kinds of performances, and more about finding ways to fit that Jim Carrey style into new contexts that audiences haven't quite seen before. Jim Carrey can't really fade into a character. He has a really hard time turning it down. And for a performer that's almost always dialed up to 11, I think that presents a pretty unique challenge. That's what I really want to dig into in this video, how Jim Carrey, one of the world's biggest stars, has tried to hold on to his relevancy while almost never reinventing himself or the kind of performances that he gives.
Ace Ventura, at your service, Husky friends. Holy Glen or Glenda! They're turning Huskies into seals!
It's kind of hard to overstate how great the year 1994 was for Jim Carrey. I don't know if I can even name another actor who had multiple movies that would go on to define the rest of their careers coming out within the same 12 months. While he was still a member of the In Living Color cast, Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, The Mask, and Dumb and Dumber were all released. And over the span of that year, he went from a prominent cast member on a network TV show to maybe the single biggest comedy star in the world. Ace Ventura was the first one out of the gate, and it kind of remains everything audiences love or are annoyed about in Jim Carrey distilled into one performance. Ace Ventura is a collection of acting tics and odd line deliveries that eventually kind of add up to an actual character. The film itself, I don't think holds up that well, and even at the time it was met with some pretty negative reviews, but audiences didn't care. Carrey's performance felt new and exciting, and the way he tends to just kind of shout lines while staggering his delivery like William Shatner made the movie feel incredibly quotable. Then came The Mask. It was probably hard to imagine a performance more over the top than Ace Ventura, but somehow Carrey pulled it off. The Mask follows Stanley, a bored bank clerk who finds a mystical mask that transforms him into, it's almost hard to describe if you haven't seen the movie. The Mask thrives on being a live-action cartoon, and managed to be a massive hit with both kids and adults by tapping into the feeling of an old Warner Brothers animated short while giving Carrey a place to just go full-on Carrey. The result is kind of exhausting, but honestly still pretty fun. The Mask, made for $23 million, ended up grossing more than $350 million at the box office, and that's in 1994 money. But maybe the most beloved Carrey film of '94 was the last one released, Dumb and Dumber. Co-starring with Jeff Daniels, Dumb and Dumber is probably the early Carrey film that's held up the best for me personally. It helps a lot for Carrey to be on equal footing with a co-star, I think, giving him someone to bounce off of. The entire movie isn't on his shoulders like the other two, and I feel like even though Lloyd is as over the top as you would expect from a Jim Carrey character, he does feel a bit more unique and divorced from Carrey's usual stick in a way that The Mask and definitely Ace Ventura do not. It's a good case of Carrey bringing his usual bag of tricks to a role, but not letting them be the entire performance. Having Jeff Daniels there being really locked in and on the same level as him means that he's actually engaging with another actor, not just putting on a crazy one-man show.
There's a new hero in town, a whirlwind of action that's positively spookhead. Yes, dare to wear the mask.
1995 marked what still might be Carrey's biggest payday in the heavily marketed Batman Forever. The Caped Crusader was in a weird place in the mid-90s. After the massive, unprecedented success of Burton's first Batman, Warner Brothers had grown very uneasy with the even stranger, grosser, and even more Tim Burton-y direction that he took in 1992's Batman Returns. For a movie expected to have fast food toy tie-ins, it was a bit too much for the studio to handle. So they famously handed the franchise off to Joel Schumacher, who was intent on putting some 60s fun back into The Dark Knight. So going with Jim Carrey probably seemed like a no-brainer. It's hard to think of a 90s actor who would fit in better on the Adam West TV show as a villain of the week than him. They even gave Carrey first billing over the new Batman himself, Val Kilmer. The result was, well, mixed. There's some stuff I kind of admire in Batman Forever, the biggest one being just how massive and insane the sets are, something you just don't see in studio movies anymore. The bizarre, artificial look of Gotham that combines the Art Deco of Burton with the neon sensibilities of Schumacher makes the movie really interesting to look at. It's unique, I'll give it that, but I'll be honest, I do not like Carrey's performance in this movie. His Riddler strikes me as a performance given by an actor told to just go wild, which is understandable, but then it's like they went into the editing room and decided to keep it all in, and it really, really drags. Tommy Lee Jones' Two-Face could have been a big asset here, a more grounded, grumpy straight man that would offset Carrey's overbearing acting. But he's turned up to 11 too, and that's not really what Jones is good at, so Two-Face kind of ends up feeling like an afterthought. Still, Batman Forever was a huge hit, bigger than Returns, and it ensured that Jim Carrey mania was far from over. The next few years brought a string of movies that kind of went up and down. 1996's The Cable Guy was a rare flop for Carrey, even though I think it's one of his more interesting films. Directed by Ben Stiller and produced by a young Judd Apatow, who would go on to create a comedy empire in the 2000s with movies like 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up, Cable Guy tapped into a much darker version of Jim Carrey's persona. What was so lovable to audiences a few years earlier about Ace Ventura was kind of turned on its head and made menacing. Carrey is really creepy here, while still giving a quintessentially Jim Carrey performance. It's maybe the only 90s comedy that he was in that I would call ahead of its time. Its almost surreal dark comedy tone feels a bit Tim and Eric in its execution, something people I guess just weren't asking for in 1996. 97 found a much safer role for Carrey in Liar Liar. This is one that I have a soft spot for, but it kind of feels a bit more dated with each passing year. Okay, maybe that's unfair. I think the premise, a lawyer is cursed to always tell the truth no matter what, leads to some really solid joke writing, and is exactly the kind of thing that Carrey can sink his teeth into while not quite going as over the top as the Riddler. Those courtroom scenes are still pretty funny. The problem, though, is the same problem I have with many studio comedies from this time, the family drama element. From what I can tell from old comedies, workaholic, upper-middle-class dads who don't see their sons enough was an epidemic in the 1990s. You see it here and in films like Jingle All the Way. You know what I'm talking about. Some kid that has the same haircut as the one in Home Alone 3 is constantly complaining about our lead character and trying to pull the viewer's heartstrings. It's just so boring. And it stops the movie dead in its tracks every time. These kids, and especially the women that are stuck playing our lead's wife, or in Liar Liar's case, ex-wife, don't really get to be characters, they're pure plot devices, acting as our leading man's conscience and not much else, which I think is the biggest thing holding back an otherwise solid movie here. Eventually, every big comedic actor wants to try their hand at a serious starring role. You'd think that would be a more difficult feat for Jim Carrey than other actors, though. I mean, he's just so over the top in such a consistent way that it was probably hard to picture him in some 90s studio drama like, I don't know, The Pelican Brief or something. Luckily for Carrey though, the absolute perfect project for him would come along in the form of The Truman Show. I like this movie a lot, and the more I think about it, the more it strikes me how well suited it is for Jim Carrey. He's a performer who's always gonna seem a little heightened. You put him in any role and there's still going to be a bit of that rubber-faced cartoonishness about him. Truman Show offsets this by casting him as a man born into a world that feels a little fake and a little off, because it's all the fictional creation of a TV show. It allows Carrey to still be Carrey while not undercutting the dramatic stakes that the film sets up. He just fits the world that he finds himself in. It's a solid script, and I still think it's the smartest use of the actor outside of a star-driven comedy.
Keep that! Turbojet Batman surprises Riddler!
Speaking of his dramatic roles though, I guess I should briefly touch on Man on the Moon, the 1999 biopic about comedian and performance artist Andy Kaufman. The only really notable thing about this movie is the extreme lengths that Carrey went to capture his Kaufman performance, as seen in the Netflix documentary Jim and Andy, where he mostly comes off like a jerk that made everyone's job way more difficult than it needed to be. Maybe I would feel differently if I liked the final product more, but as it stands, it's a pretty standard, unremarkable biopic. And I think it was just a really poor meeting of actor and director. Man on the Moon was directed by Milos Forman, who had made legitimate classics like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Amadeus. In an interview on Mark Maron's podcast, Edward Norton, who starred in Forman's The People vs. Larry Flint, described how the director liked to work collaboratively, flying by the seat of his pants and kind of building a half-baked idea into a full vision on set by talking over things with his actors and making creative choices in the moment. That just wasn't gonna happen with Jim Carrey, who seems to have behaved more like a kid who needed a babysitter than a creative partner on the film. Then, finally, we get to the 2000s, and a few movies that just aren't super notable to me. Me, Myself, and Irene, Fun with Dick and Jane, and a pretty fun turn as Count Olaf in a series of unfortunate events was fine, but didn't exactly push him out of his comfort zone. Bruce Almighty was probably his second biggest hit of the decade, and while I wouldn't call it amazing or anything, it's the kind of high-concept premise that plays to Carrey's strengths. And in many ways, it kind of feels like it marks the end of his tenure as the biggest comedy star in the world, giving way to Will Ferrell a year or two later. But it's The Grinch that I find the most interesting here, because it kind of presaged what was to come. In the early 2000s, Hollywood was in the process of becoming less star-driven and more brand-driven, for better or for worse. And to maintain their star power, many big-name actors want to find a franchise role that fits the specific thing they do well. You can see this with Will Smith in Aladdin and in Suicide Squad, and Jim Carrey himself in Sonic the Hedgehog. Grinch almost feels like the beginning of that process, where this trade-off of star and brand is still happening. It's a movie counting on your nostalgia, like so many movies seem to do now, but it still thinks of its star as the most marketable element. It's a Jim Carrey film that happens to be about the Grinch, where the recent animated movie was a Grinch movie that happened to star Benedict Cumberbatch. After a good dramatic turn in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and a mildly embarrassing but kinda fun one in The Number 23, it kind of started to feel like the era of Carrey was over. Yes Man feels like the last true Jim Carrey movie to me. A big, star-driven adult comedy that counts on his name to get people in the theater. And it actually did pretty well. But for one reason or another, Jim Carrey's career seemed to recede a bit, giving way to younger stars or just actors less tied to the 90s, only occasionally starring in a modest hit like Popper's Penguins. In 2013, he had an interesting role in Kick-Ass 2 as Colonel Stars and Stripes. And while I think the movie falls short of the first film overall, Carrey's performance is a big bright spot here. Once again, his Jim Carrey-ness is very much turned up and dialed in, but to a much more sinister effect. His manic energy matches up really well with this psycho vigilante character, and it stretches Carrey's chops more than anything had in years, in my opinion. But the movie was poorly received, even by Carrey himself, who refused to do promotion for it after he became uncomfortable with the film's gun violence. A few roles later, including a TV show that almost no one has heard of, and a forgettable Dumb and Dumber sequel, were finally brought to Sonic the Hedgehog, which feels like the perfect encapsulation of modern Hollywood. It's a very smart piece of brand management, hitting the beats of fan service that people seem to want and having a pretty breezy, fun time doing it. It's a pretty likable film, but not a super memorable one. For Carrey though, I think it says a lot about where his career is at. He's still a huge star. His face is on the poster, he's in the marketing a lot, but make no mistake, Sonic is the real draw here. Unlike his Grinch movie, where the tone of the film is molded to fit its star's sensibilities, not the tone of the source material, he's more used as a flavor in Sonic, not the main course. Jim Carrey is as Jim Carrey as ever in the film, but the studios are now counting on the brands to sell the movies, not people showing up just to see him. Whether that's better or worse than the star-driven era of the 80s and especially the 90s, I'll leave up to you. In the end, I think one of the most interesting things about Jim Carrey is just how little he's changed. You could see his Dr. Robotnik performance coming right after Ace Ventura and fitting right in. And there's something kind of weird about that. You look at his Dumb and Dumber co-star Jeff Daniels and all the different kinds of performances that he's given since 1994, and it's clear they've gone in very different directions. Jim Carrey probably doesn't have to work that much if he doesn't want to. After all, he's Jim Carrey. And judging by the box office numbers for Sonic the Hedgehog, that's still enough for millions around the world. While his performances may be similar a lot of the time, there's still a lot of different filmmaking styles to be found throughout these movies. And if you're someone who's been thinking of diving into the world of directing and cinematography, I highly recommend indie filmmaking. Get the blockbuster look on a DIY budget. Almost no one has studio resources at our disposal, but this class is all about helping you create great looking footage without any of that. In true indie spirit, it breaks down the ways to do fun, energetic action without some giant studio green screen. And if filmmaking interests you, you really can't go wrong checking it out. And you can look into it right now on Skillshare. Whether it's filmmaking, writing, entrepreneurship, or something else entirely, chances are you'll find it on Skillshare. Because Skillshare has thousands and thousands of classes to pick from. So click on the link in the description below and get 2 months of access to those classes absolutely free. And on top of that, the premium membership is less than $10 a month. Get started by going to skl.sh/captainmidnight28.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.